I should have called this one 3.5 since it's really just a continuation of the last episode. But I figured you wouldn't want a 45-minute tutorial, so here we are, part 4. And today, we will finish off the low poly model. Load up the Blender file that you saved at the end of the last video. If you are not in the main workspace right now, click up here on Layout to get there. We're going to duplicate our single low poly donut 7 times and position each one right on top of its corresponding high poly donut. Before we get started, go to Object Mode and hit Alt-H to make sure everything that was hidden is now visible again. If you are zoomed way out again like me, then use Shift-C or the mouse wheel or / to focus back in on your plate of donuts. And if your sprinkles look a little speckly and weird, then you may need to hit N to open the side window and adjust the clip start value right here in the View tab. We are now going to create copies of this low poly donut and position them, one at a time, over the existing high poly versions. I'm going to walk through the first one in detail, and then I'll show the rest in fast forward since it's exactly the same process over and over. You'll be using the same functions for each one, and I'm sure you'll get the idea after we do one together. Let's get started. Select the low poly donut, and if you have trouble clicking on it, just use the collection pane over here to select it. Then Shift-D to duplicate it, and G to move it up to about where the next donut is. Now select everything except this donut and use H to hide those objects so that you can better see just the donut you're working on. Select the low poly donut, hit 7 on the numpad so you can see it from the top view. Now you can see this is not aligned, so I'll hit G and slide this into place. Remember that in orthographic view, the movement will remain in the same plane, which makes this quick and easy to do. Wireframe is very helpful here, so I'll select that up here at the top. And then zoom in a little bit and use G again to align the low poly donut as closely as I can to the high poly donut. Then I'll hit 1 on the numpad for front view, R to rotate, and G to move. And I'll repeat this as needed to get this aligned. The scale looks just a little smaller for this donut, so I'm going to use S and then tap Z twice, so I can scale this just slightly along the vertical axis. Then I hit G and Z twice, so I can move it up a smidge along that same axis. And then down just a tiny bit. And I'm also going to rotate it around its own axis by hitting R and then double Z again. Now hopefully you've noted that hitting the axis twice, such as double Z for example, makes the object act as the pivot point for transformations, whereas only hitting it once uses the global origin or the 3D cursor. The double tap is super handy, so don't forget about it. Here I'll hit G one more time with no other keys so that I can move this freely, just a tad bit more to get it better aligned. And now that looks good from this angle. I'll hit numpad 7 to check from the top again, and now you can see I have to adjust it a little bit more. So I hit G and move it into place. Then 1 on the numpad again to make sure it is still aligned from that angle, and that looks good. Last, I'll just rotate my view all around to check all the angles. And this looks good. The low poly donut is nicely aligned over the high poly donut. The alignment needs to be as close as you can reasonably get, or else you may not get good results when we start baking later on. And don't worry if you don't know what that means just yet. So that's 2 donuts done. We've got 6 to go. Use Alt-H to bring everything back. Then select the original low poly donut and Shift-D to duplicate it again, and G to move that copy up for the 3rd donut. Hide all the rest of the donuts, and then position the low poly so that it aligns with the high poly in the same way we did the last one. Although I'm going to show this pretty quickly here, feel free to pause and take your time until you have a low poly donut aligned as closely as possible to each of the high poly donuts. Remember to use the numpad to see the view from all angles. Use G to move, R to rotate, S to scale, but only if that's really needed, and use X, Y, and Z to constrain movements to a specific axis, or Shift X, Y, or Z to exclude one axis. And remember that hitting the axis twice will use the object as the pivot point instead of the global or 3D cursor. Wireframe is also your friend. And make sure you check each donut from all sides and angles before you call it done to make sure that it fits well. I will acknowledge here that there's probably something much more clever that you can do by aligning origins of the low poly and high poly, or probably even using the snapping function up here. So please feel free to play around with this and do it however makes sense to you. And you may find a way faster way of doing that. And if so, share that in the comments so everyone else can also benefit. The method of how you do this doesn't really matter as long as you end up with low poly donuts that are aligned to the high poly donuts by the end of the process. I also suggest that you take the time to organize your outliner as you go along. Click on the donut names here as you duplicate them and rename them to something a little more sensible. You may notice that I've got some gaps in my donut stack, and these will need to be fixed at some point, but we can ignore that for now and just focus on getting the low poly aligned with the high poly. And there we go. It took a little bit of time, but that wasn't too terrible. And I think this is looking good with everything nicely aligned. Now with that done, we need to work on the UV map again because we now have 8 donuts instead of just 1. And all of these need to be separate islands on our UV map since each donut looks different, which means that each one has to have a unique texture. I'm just going to hide the high poly model for now by clicking the little eye here next to its collection in the outliner. Then I'll fix the name of my last low poly donut, and then I'll select all the low poly donuts by right-clicking on that collection and choosing Select Objects. Now I select the UV editing workspace. Then hover in the pane where the donuts are and hit A to select all the vertices of our low poly donuts. Since we duplicated the same donut to make all 8 of these, we have exactly the same UV island duplicated 8 times. And they're all stacked up here on top of each other in the corner. If we leave them all here on top of each other, the donuts would all end up looking identical, since they would all use whatever texture image we put up here in the corner. But this isn't what we want. We want the donuts to look different from each other, so we're going to separate these 8 islands and arrange them all across the grid. Over here in the UV pane, click this little double arrow button up here to sync the selection between the 2 windows. Then move your mouse back to the 3D model pane, tab out to Object Mode, and select just one donut. Then tab back to Edit Mode. Hover over the UV island and hit L to select all the linked polygons. Then hit G and move this whole island to a new spot. Our goal here is to have each rectangular island in its own place on the UV map. 4 going across the top and 4 going across the bottom, with a little buffer space between the islands themselves and between the edges of the 2D plane. Use the grid to help space the island appropriately. I'm actually going to put this one down in the bottom left corner. We can tweak these all a little bit later. First, let's just repeat this process so that we get all 8 islands separated. When that one is placed, tab back to Object Mode, select another donut, tab to Edit Mode, and move the mouse back to the UV pane. Hover over the island or click on a vertex in that island and hit L to make sure that the whole thing is selected. Then use G to move it into a new position. Since this is just a lot of repetition, I'm going to speed up this part of the video again. We just keep doing the same thing that we've done, repeating this process for each donut, and placing each UV island in a separate place on the grid. Once you have all 8 of them separated, turn off the Sync Select button up here, then hover back in the 3D model pane, go to Object Mode, and select all of the low poly donuts again. Tab to Edit Mode, use A to select all of the vertices, and now you should be able to see all 8 of the UV islands on the UV map. I'm going to make some final tweaks here. First, I'll make this UV editing pane a little bit bigger, and then, while hovering over an island, I'll hit L to select all the vertices that are linked on that island, which should be the whole thing. And then I'll use G to move it so that it's aligned nicely and evenly with the first island. Then I'll click one vertex on the next island, hit L to select the whole thing, and G to move it a little bit. Now I'm being totally perfectionistic here. These really look pretty good as they are, but it makes me happy to have them aligned just right. I'm also doing this manually, and I'm sure Text Tools or some other add-on can probably do this all by itself with one click of a button. So again, you do whatever works for you. The end goal is this: all 8 UV islands arranged nicely on the grid. And that's it for the donuts. Finally! They are almost ready for our baking step, which we will get to in just another couple of videos. Now before we can worry about that, we've got to get the plate all fixed up. I'll click the eye here in the outliner to bring back my high poly model. Then I'm going to select the plate, hit Ctrl-I to invert my selection, and H to hide everything so that I'm left with only the high poly plate visible. Now is a good time to save again. I should probably be doing this a lot more often. Now, this plate is about 9,000 tries, which is definitely too many. So we need to make a new low poly version. We're going to do this using a different approach than we did for the donuts. Instead of making a new mesh, we're going to duplicate this high poly plate and then dissolve some of the loop edges to reduce its geometry. Now, I know from attempting this once already that my high poly plate has a few issues, including having duplicate vertices. So I'm first going to fix that by going to Edit Mode, A to select all, and M to merge by distance. I'm going to set my distance to 0.0001, and then here you can see that got rid of 300 vertices that were all duplicates. Now we go back to Object Mode, Shift D to duplicate the plate, and right-click to cancel the movement so it stays exactly in place. I'm going to hit M to put this new copy in a collection, and I'll select the low poly collection from the list. Then I will click on the new low poly plate in the outliner and rename it, and then use the outliner to hide the high poly plate by clicking the little eye next to it. Alright, so this is now going to be our low poly plate, but we need to reduce its poly count. Go into Edit Mode and start selecting loops on the plate mesh to dissolve. Remember that this is Alt-click to select the loop, and then X, dissolve edges, to eliminate them. Just like with the donuts, our aim is to keep the silhouette of the plate, but use as few vertices as required to do that. There isn't really a right or a wrong way to do this here, so use your own judgment. And I'm going to speed this up again a little bit because it's just the same thing over and over. As I mentioned in the last video, dissolve edges did not play very nicely when I had multiple loops selected. So I ended up doing mine mostly one loop at a time. This is probably because I didn't do a great job modeling this plate in the first place, but, well, we live and learn, right? If you remove a loop and then decide that you don't like how the shape looks, just Ctrl-Z to undo. I'm chopping my plate pretty aggressively here, and for this tutorial I'm not going to agonize over that too much. But it's good to take your time during optimization and do what makes sense while achieving a nice shape and good geometry. For these side loops, I'm going to use the checker deselect method again here and just do it a little differently. First, I go to Edge Select Mode by clicking this button or hitting 2 on the main keyboard. Then I select just 2 parallel edges using Shift-Click. Then I go to Select, Select Loops, and Edge Rings. Then I go to Checker Deselect, and I'm going to put the middle number for selected at 2 so that it will pick 2 adjacent edges. And finally, to select the whole loop of all of these, go to Select, Select Loops, Edge Loops. Now I can hit X and dissolve edges, and that's quickly finished. Now I think this looks pretty good, except that if I look at the plate from the top, I see the same issue that we had with the donuts. It's a bit blocky around the rim. Let me turn on statistics here in the overlay menu, and let's see where we are. Now I think it's worth spending a few more tries on this, because players will probably see this plate from the top, so we want it to actually look even more round than this. To do that, I'm going to take the same approach that I did before, which is using the knife tool to make some cuts around this top face loop. I'll hit 7 on the numpad for top view, and this time I'm going to be a little more careful so that I don't cut down across multiple loops. I use K to activate the tool, click on the starting point, click on the ending point, and hit Enter to make the cut. Now here I see I'm still in Edge Select mode. I want to hit 1 on the main keyboard to go back to Vertex Select. This time, I'm actually not going to move each set of vertices on its own, so I'm just going to leave them selected as I keep moving around this plate using the knife tool. Again, I will speed this up because it's the same repetitive thing over and over. Keep cutting all the way around, being careful to only cut the 2 adjacent loops. You can tell which one will be cut because it'll turn green as you mouse over it. If you want to be more precise about the placement of the cut, you can select the middle of each edge by holding Ctrl while you are cutting. While I'm doing this, I want to note that although I've taken this approach on both the donuts and the plate, to only add geometry to one face loop, other methods may be better. Non-uniform optimization like this is acceptable, as long as it looks good and the topology is sensible. But my advice is to look at lots of examples and watch experts at work so that you get different ideas on how to approach things. Okay, once all the cuts have been made, you can scale all those new vertices out just a smidge, although that might not even be necessary since just adding geometry can help round out the silhouette. Now, here for some reason I clicked off to deselect them all, so now I will hit C for Circle Select, and then go around and select all my new vertices again. You can scroll with the mouse wheel to change the size of a selection circle. And once that's done, I'll hit S to scale. And here, nothing seems to be happening, so let me change the transform point up here using this button, and I'm going to try median point. Now when I use S to scale, I get some action, and this actually needs a very little movement to smooth out the shape. Now, there we go. I think this looks pretty nice. That's about 700 tries now in the low poly plate versus almost 9,000 in the high poly version. For reference, the Skyrim silver plate has about 400 tries. So even my low poly model might be a bit excessive, but it works well enough for our purposes. Now we're almost there, I promise. The last step is to UV unwrap this mesh, and this can be done by making a couple of big circles. So pick one edge loop in an area that is least noticeable. I'm going to do it here for the very bottom of the plate. Alt-click on an edge to select the whole loop, and then mark that as a seam by hitting U and M. Select the UV editing workspace, hover over the plate and hit A to select all, then hit U and U again to unwrap it. Now in this UV map, I'm going to go a little bit rogue here and overlap these plate islands. Overlapping islands is not something to do lightly. You need to be very thoughtful about why you're doing it and how it's going to look. Remember that all the textures come from the UV map being projected onto the mesh. So if we overlap these islands, the top and bottom of the plate are going to look identical. In my case, I'm going to make this into a plain ceramic plate. There will be no designs that have to be baked on, just the shading information, and so I think this is actually going to work nicely. And it means we'll be able to use more of the UV space, which is always a good thing. The bottom of the plate will need to be shaded flat, just like the top middle of the plate, so I'm going to put the smaller island, which is the plate bottom, into the middle of the other island. I select it, G to move, and S to scale. And then I'll box select both islands, use S to scale them up, and G to move them until they fill the UV space with just a little bit of buffer between the edge of the island and the edge of the grid. Ideally, you want your UV islands to fill at least 70 to 80% of the grid space, and that way you will get most bang for your buck with texture resolution. Now we haven't got anything else that we can squeeze into the corners on our map, so this is the best we're going to get. But note that if we were making some other matching items, we could have them share this UV map and the texture files by squeezing them into the corners on this UV grid. All right, so I think we're in good shape now. We have the low poly model made and unwrapped. Go ahead and save your file, and we will stop here for now. Next time, we're going to go back to the high poly model and get it all set up so that we can use material IDs. And now I'll ask, how is this whole thing going for you so far? I know there's a lot to do and a lot to explain, but I hope that you've been able to follow along and that you've arrived at this point successfully. I'll see you again soon for the next episode. Bye!